We're here with Shania Levin, the founder and CEO of Codebase, a developer tool that helps developers and teams better onboard, refactor, and understand code bases. And before starting Codebase, she led teams that delivered high-quality products and features for leading companies including Google, Docker, eBay, and Cloudflare. Welcome, Shania.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really, really excited to be here. I'm excited to give this talk. As Angie said, I've been in dev tools for more than 10 years. And one thing that I know about the experience is that it has always sucked onboarding to a new code base. Every developer, whether you are at a new company or contributing to open source, if your application isn't Hello World, you must onboard to that code base. And so therefore you must learn the code base and learn how it works before you can actually modify it. And I showed up today with a secret. Are you ready? I figured it out, and the secret is, in order to learn a code base, you need to pair. You need to pair all the time, for all time, 24/7. And that's the end of the talk. Mostly kidding. But for those of you who, for whatever reason, can't pair every second of the day when you're trying to learn a new code base, maybe you're just starting in open source, or maybe you're just getting your foot in the door at a new area and it's not comfortable for you, or you're in a different time zone, or you've got Zoom fatigue. I want to share some tips with you all today and kind of make sure that you all know that it does suck and it does get better. So I'll start by telling a story. This story is about Shane and her first day at Acme. And Shane is, bright-eyed, and she's bushy-tailed and ready to ship some code. She's ready to prove herself. But like I said before, much like you all probably, she's got to learn the code base first. So pretty soon, Shane finds out that onboarding to this legacy code base of the company that she just joined totally sucks. It's really hard. It's time consuming. And Shane is personally having a really hard time. So why is it, in fact, that onboarding is so hard? Well, when you are onboarding to a new code base, this is all of the things that you need to know. So, but, I have this saying that every code base is like its own unique plate of spaghetti. So it's not exactly the same every single time, but in general, some tips to follow should get you started. Tips are broken down into 3 major parts. So first, you need to know the code or the system. You need to understand how to work with the code or work with the team. And then finally, how do you just be a human? What is the reality of being a human being and how that affects your day-to-day life as an engineer? So first, you need to understand when you're onboarding to a new company's system, you need to understand the code of the system. You need to understand how actually the code is connected. What are all the execution paths? What are all the function calls? What other functions call other functions? What are the actual details? What is the high-level architecture? What are all of the domain objects? What are all of the nitty-gritty details? When it comes to working with the team, you need to know, what is the code review process? What's all the design patterns? What are all the testing patterns? What are all of those gotchas in the code, the things that you just kind of hold in your head or the team holds in their head and it's not really written down? What are all of the deployment procedures? And finally, you need to know and deeply kind of understand just the reality of being human. So as developers, our main goal is to ship things. It's to write code. It's not meant to write everything down. And so when you don't write all of these things down, when your team doesn't write all of these things down, it gets out of date and it's very, very hard for you to understand. And many times that information is not in the code. Repetition and retention. Turns out that when you join a new company, you're trying to onboard to a code base for the first time, or you have a new team member who's trying to do the same. You're only going to retain about 30% of what you're told in your first week. So even though, you're likely going to really need to understand, or someone told you, or you told your team member, you're likely going to need to tell them again. Turns out it's really, really hard to learn code. Turns out that the way that we learn code hasn't changed in about 50 years. So the process of reading code and understanding in and of itself is insufficient. So we read code one line at a time, and we imagine how our systems work. That's what we do. That's just how it has always been. There's very little to help us make sense of the code. And the data could be abstracted with types. It can be completely missing if your company happens to use an untyped language. And reading is actually the most manual way to extract information out of code. So therefore, reading and understanding code then takes at least 60% of our time and effort, everywhere from between onboarding, as we mentioned, but then you have to read and deep dive when you're debugging, when you're doing code reviews, or when you're doing feature work. And then at the same time, we've got these huge, huge systems. We actually have 10 times more code than we've ever had. And those systems are constantly changing. So while you are trying to understand the code, your teammates are shipping code at the exact same time. So it's literally changing from under you. So no wonder that Shane, and probably, you all, when you're joining a new company, it's going to have a hard time. But that experience, your sucky experience, is literally about to get worse. Because onboarding, unfortunately, isn't a single point in time. It's constant. It's constantly onboarding to new things. Here are a few examples. So during Shane's onboarding, Tommy over here ships a new feature. And that feature needs to get integrated with Shane's feature. Guess what? She needs to onboard to it. Then, after a couple weeks, she gets added to an on-call rotation. So, and then in the middle of the night, your system goes down. And surprise, when you are in the middle of the night and the system goes down, this is not a normal part of your area typically. So you're onboarding again. You're just doing it at 2 a.m. The only option at that point is to just figure it out. When people leave, so because we are constantly always visualizing everything in our heads, those mental models that we keep go out the door when people leave, whether that person is leaving voluntarily or, unfortunately, in today's market, involuntarily. And they were typically the only ones who kind of knew how that cool widget feature thing worked. And there's no documentation at all. And now it's your problem. So you're just onboarding again. In another case, restructuring, teams get moved around, an individual person, the flip side of that could get promoted. So your org might be restructured. And then therefore your team's responsibilities have changed. So you're onboarding again. And in the promoted case, depending on how fast that team ships code, the person's knowledge is actually going to get out of date really, really quickly as they are trying to onboard to their new responsibilities. So in fact, you're just kind of stuck onboarding again. Big refactors. Many people don't know this or consider this, but when you're trying to complete a big refactor project, it's just actually one big onboarding. For instance, when you're trying to refactor a monolith into microservices, you're trying to break things down, or you're trying to, go back from a microservices to a monolith, or, some gradation of service, microservice, not so microservices in between. All of those things, you need to really deeply understand how all of the variations work, what's actually kind of helping or happening under the hood. And so you need to actually onboard to the whole code base so that you can make sure that you know how all of the parts are involved and how they're connected, so that you can ensure that everything gets into the new system without breaking. And then finally, every single time you do a code review when you're working on your new team is like its own little mini onboarding experience. So essentially you need to like read the code in your head. You're trying to remember the related code and imagine how it all works together. And that's just another mini onboarding. And then you're just taking that code and kind of blowing it out to years and years and years of legacy code. People coming in and out, maybe acquisitions, maybe someone completed that half refactor, and there's a bunch of tech debt. So you're just kind of constantly onboarding. So you're probably wondering at this point, Shanae, I thought you said that you would help. So I'm going to help you with some tips now. So here's what you can do to not have that sucky experience as much as you can. It's broken up again into 3 parts. Advice for the team, advice for the onboardee, and advice for continuous onboarding. So again, advice is in general, and there are always exceptions. Some people thrive where some other people struggle, but advice for the team in general: start small in scope and expand strategically. So you want to provide some small early wins. Choose some tasks that help your teammate build confidence and help you build confidence. Trying to require learning as few new things as possible for each task. Make sure that if you're on the flip side, that you are trying to ask for, compact things and make sure that you write things down. There's actually a lot to learn when you're learning simple things. It's typically more than you realize. So problem solving in a new code base is actually really tricky. And it's sometimes really hard to feel confident that you've considered all of the edge cases. So goal is to have, build your confidence as part of the new team. You can start them out in a small part of the code base as possible. Learn all of the relevant pieces without getting overwhelmed. You don't want to start your new onboardee in a huge challenge that people have been avoiding. So you can ask a lot of questions to make sure that you're not falling into one of those cases as well. But also try not to stay on super tiny things for long. You want to start small, but build consistently. I like to have the first task to be updating the docs for something. So there's a lot of little details that you can use to familiarize yourself with just by creating the code review, filling out the code review template, getting it approved, and merging it. You don't have to worry about worrying about having to get feedback on your code. Also, correct anything that wasn't right in the repo setup instructions, or write them up if they don't exist is another great way. You can write up commit a small personal bio to the repo with maybe time zones, communication preferences like Slack or email, technical experience, or fun facts. It can be really helpful on a remote team. And be creative to try to get through the whole process, see that whole process, get that out of the way, and then you can focus on your code. So once you're ready to get into the code, make sure that you don't need to understand all of the details about how the entire system works to get the task done. So that helps you to build confidence that you did it right in the first place. You can gain a bit of confidence just by feeling like you're an expert in some small piece and then growing out from there. So a few examples: a bug fix in an area that's well tested, a small team task that other folks know how to solve but just haven't gotten around to yet. You can walk through the code that they're going to touch and some of the patterns to use to change it. So all that you really need to do is get familiar, write the code, and not actually have to figure out how to solve anything. Another example might be a very isolated feature with minimal risk of breaking anything, like change a button on a link or have an endpoint return one more attribute. Tech Tech debt is a really great early task. Even, some tedious things like upgrades or maintenance. As a new team member, you can feel like you accomplished something good, and you've learned something, and the team will really appreciate you for it. And then this is key. You want to let each task kind of grow from there, maybe more tasks in small tasks in new areas, but ideally, slightly larger tasks in the same area. Again, your real job here is to help them feel or help yourself feel confident, like you're an expert in that area. And as soon as you can be kind of the go-to person, the better. So advice for you is the onboardee again. So you're wanting to look for a few specific things to kind of wrap your head around the code base when you're thinking about the code and the system and how it works. So you want to know, what are the domain objects? What are the users in your system? What are the key flows? So a couple of examples might be, if you're in an e-commerce platform, that might be understanding how do you define a product? How do you define the shopping cart? What's the flow from pricing or discounts or adding something to the cart? In dev tools, it might be, how do you define a code base? What is a dependency or a commit or a pull request? In ed tech, that might be, an assignment or an activity or a lesson or a grade. And some user examples in your system for e-commerce might be like a customer or a seller. And in dev tools, it might be a developer or a team lead. And in ed tech, it might be teacher or student. And then you want to make sure that you understand the key flows. So key flows in e-com might be, customer makes a purchase. What are all of those steps that they go through in the system? Seller lists a product. What happens in your architecture? In dev tools, it might be, developer creates a new commit. What actually happens? Or system analyzes the code base. Like what triggers what or what calls what? How do you understand those details? And in ed tech, it might be something similar, like teacher creates an assignment or student answers a question. It might seem silly, but these are really good things to just get down and get a full end-to-end understanding of. So some best practices. You want to ask and be comfortable asking. Lots of people will know some of these things, but it's better to ask in the first couple weeks. Don't be afraid. And constantly ask questions, because it will help you make your lives a lot easier. Exploring the marketing site might be a great way to kind of wrap your head around stuff. Reading the docs. You might want to, whether that's like user docs or dev docs, but you don't want to 100% trust the docs. You want to read to kind of get a big picture, but you don't want to necessarily 100% think that every detail in the docs are going to be correct. And whatever you do, please write stuff down. Draw it out so you don't have to ask again or figure it out again. Again, you will forget 70% of the things that you learned in the first couple of weeks. You want to start from the key flows and then expand to the architecture. Make sure that you start there and maybe draw them out. What are the key components? How do they talk to each other? You want to start piecing these things together to try to get a picture of the architecture. What are the most important components in your system? What is responsible for each of those domain objects or use cases, and how do they talk to each other? So this is an example of a monolith. Again, you want, once you're starting to put things together, you want to make sure that you have an example like this that will help you to get a full picture of your system. Again, best strategies would be asking a teammate, reading the tests is a good way, just reading the code and creating a diagram or diagramming things out yourself, and then double checking with the team to make sure that it looks right. Next, you want to understand the low-level things. What are the frameworks? Not just, that your company uses React. You really want to know that they use React plus Redux plus React Query and functional components, and they use the React testing libraries. You want to kind of deep dive and get a detailed understanding of what are all of the underlying frameworks. Best strategies to kind of learn this, you want to make sure that you at least go through some basic tutorials or guides for each framework and library. You want to know how to use the tools that you're using. You want to be able to understand the coding patterns. What coding patterns are encouraged? Which ones are discouraged? Every company is going to be different. Some best strategies to learn this might be, looking at recent code reviews to see how things are done most recently. You want to read the code and then use a tool like GitLens to find that code review. When you're working on a task and reach a decision point, you want to ask a teammate what that pattern likes to use before you say it's done and ask for the code review. You want to understand the development process. Questions that you should probably look to answer might be, how do we commit? How do we do a code review? How do we deploy? How do we plan a new feature? How do we give status updates? And how do we retro? Next, you want to look out for code-based kind of tribal knowledge. If you make a change here, you also need to make a code change over there. You don't want to touch this function because if you do, without proper knowledge of how to do it, site performance might go down. You want to start to understand all of those things and look out for it. And then, again, write stuff down. I'm going to say this multiple times. It is going to be very, very helpful for you. Don't try to have it in your head. It will be, again, because you're going to forget. Take notes. Drawing out diagrams, like I showed before, is very, very helpful. Adding comments to the code will help everyone if they're not there, and try to update the documentation as you go. So advice for teams, you want to make it easy to learn some of these things if you're on the team and you're accepting a new teammate. You want to have them understand what are the domain objects and the user flows and the key flows. How do the key flows fit in the architecture? What are the frameworks? What are best coding patterns that we're following and avoiding, and the development process, as I mentioned. So here's a thought. There are lots of tools. You might be thinking, oh, there's a tool for this, or there might be a tool for that. There's a tool for notes. There are tools for reading code, but they're all separate tools. And likely they're still going to get out of date because they aren't connected to the main thing that you're trying to learn, which is your code. So why should we actually have to draw out key flows by hand when the computer already knows how to run our code? Why, in fact, do we have to keep reminding people about patterns and processes? It's really easy to miss stuff, and we don't, on our current teams, make it easy for our team members or you as the new onboardee to learn this stuff. And turns out that computers are actually much better at automating some of these things than the manual reading code line by line in our brains. And again, every code review is a little mini onboarding experience, but our tools don't really help us to onboard. They help us to just comment on a bunch of lines that are listed alphabetically. So for continuous onboarding, what if we could actually achieve that goal? What if all of the maps and the key flows and diagrams were all drawn out for you? What if you could just start from a file and expand until you understood the architecture? Or what if your teammates reminded you of the patterns that you should follow, like right here, right there in your PR? What if, every PR you could understand the impact that your code change has on the rest of the architecture? That is what we're actually building at Codesy. You could absolutely just use a tool like Codesy. There are lots of other tools as well in the code visualization space. It's a new, exciting space that's really designed to help you feel comfortable and confident learning all of the code, even as it's changing out from under you. So really try to invest or advise your team to try to use, whether it's Codesy or not, some kind of tool to help you feel confident in the process. We can solve a lot of problems with having our tools help us to onboard a bit more. So, in conclusion, onboarding is hard, it sucks, but it can be easier. Thank you so much for listening to my talk.
Thank you, Shania. That was excellent. We ran a little over, so I'm going to have to stop us now. Thank you so much. And I know you'll be back tomorrow with a workshop, so don't miss out on that. It is one of the most, highly bookmarked sessions if you look at the schedule. So
amazing.
We're definitely
really excited to see.
Great. All right. See you tomorrow.
Bye.